Welcome to this podcast episode in my podcast series around vertical development. In this week's episode, I'll look into the first leadership stage, which is called the experts. But before I go into the expert stage, which is the first out of 5 leadership stages, I just want to touch briefly upon the stages prior to the leadership stages, because we all undergo development throughout our lives. And we all start with the stage which is called the explorer. So think in a baby crawling around the floor, exploring things, putting things in their mouth, smelling to things, listening to things, and so on. They're exploring the world. Typically describes people from 0 to 2 years old. Then that is replaced with the enthusiast. That is running until maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. An enthusiast, that is where you get very excited around all the things you can suddenly do that you haven't been able to do in the past. For instance, you can begin to walk, maybe you can cycle, you can begin to speak, you can begin to do different things, and you get very excited about all the things you can suddenly do. The third stage we all undergo is what you call the operator. And the operator stage is very well described in the cartoon Inside Out. You may have seen it around little Riley, who is moving with her parents to San Francisco. And you follow how all her emotions in the brain is kind of leading her. So she is very much led by her emotions and not so much around how she actually wants to do. It's more driven by emotions. It also means when you're operating at the operator level, you're very often very black and white. So reflection capacity is incredibly limited, and attention is very much to your own feelings and your own emotions, which is very well described in that cartoon. Short-term needs and own needs are kind of high priority as well. The next stage we then move into as human beings are the conformer. That typically hits us when we get into our teenage years. And it's around being identified with a group, a belonging to a group. You can almost imagine, the group of girls in high school standing with the same jackets and the same kind of outfit. The guys, the same, just in another group. Then you may have a third group of girls looking different again. And everyone identifies themselves with a certain group, and they do their utmost to stay within that group and not feel that they are being disapproved or not belonging to it. So it's very vital for that. That conformity describes that age. Then the next stage is the expert stage, which is then the first out of the 5 leadership stages. So we have the expert as the first leadership stage. The second is called the achiever. The third one is called catalyst, the fourth co-creator, and then the highest is called the alchemist. So the expert stage is the first, which is described in this framework as a leadership stage. So how does a leader typically unfold at the expert stage? Well, if you are an expert, you will typically focus a lot on expertise, and you will focus a lot on position in the organization. So devil is in the detail. You really enjoy working very in depth with a certain area, and you always believe that it can be refined. You can do more to make it better. Maybe you're working on a note, and that note can be written over and over again, and you can constantly improve it a little bit. Or you may be working in another field, marketing presentation, and you can continuously make changes to it so it just becomes better. You also tend to really appreciate other people with strength within a certain area. So you will have a tendency to appreciate other leaders who are very strong in a field, whereas if you meet leaders who are not so strong in their field, then you may not see that as a strength, but more as a weak leader, because for you it's really, really important that the manager is strong in their expertise. In leadership, it's typically task-oriented. So when you operate at the expert stage, you typically see your employees, if you have a group of employees, for what they are doing, i.e. their task. So when you approach them, a typical approach would be to help them improve what they're working on. Again, if it's a marketing presentation or a note or something like that, you will help them refine, write it over, change the color, do something to make it perfect. And therefore, you help them grow in the task. That is your focus, the task, not the person per se. There is another group of experts that are not so task-oriented. They are in the other end, they're very much people-oriented. So they focus a lot on the people and very little on the task. So typically at the expert stage, you would either be very focused on the task or on the person, people. How is the dynamic between your team members? How are they engaged? How are they feeling and so on, but not so much the task they're working on. So typically it's very much either on one side or the other side. Most leaders operating at the expert stage would be operating towards the task, i.e. the detail. Devil is in the detail. Leaders operating at the expert stage also tend to choose what is most urgent when they have to make leadership decisions. That does not always equate into what is most important. So what is most urgent, that may be, let's assume that you have a team and you're short of staff. People are really running tight. You will go out, put up your sleeves, and you will go out and help them. You would work with them to show that you're with them, and you will be a good team member with them. The most important may actually have been to sit and address the underlying problem. Why do we have vacancies? Go out and hire new people and so on. So your prioritization may be to do what you consider to be most urgent, but that doesn't necessarily equate into what is most important. The most important may be to go out and hire some new people. Hence the problem is being solved once and for all. Some expert leaders can come across as being very silo thinking, and that fits very well into that way of looking into expertise. So because they are so highly focused on what they're very good at, they tend to see that as being the center of the universe. It also means that what is happening in other functions, for instance, if you are working in finance, you may not look so much into what is happening in marketing or operations or HR and so on. It's very important within finance what you're doing. And even within finance, there would be sub-functions. So you may be very in the detail in a task within tax or treasury or accounting or something like that. And you may not look so much into how are the other functions actually doing and how are they being impacted by what you're doing, because there is so much you can do within your field that becomes your main focus. That leaders at the expert stage very often focus on the expertise and not so much the people comes actually very naturally if you look into the involvement they have taken from the conformer stage up to the expert stage. So to go from one stage to the next, they have typically gone to an education. They may have gone to a business school or university or technical school or some kind of education where they have for years improved a certain knowledge within a certain area, and they have built up a strength which has made them an expert within that. That has also been the education that has lifted them up to operate at the expert stage. So suddenly they're very solid, knowledgeable within a certain area, and that area becomes kind of the main center of focus for them. They may work in a corporate then, and that corporate may be one of those that promotes the people who are best within their field. So you may have been very, very good at a given task. You have improved and you've been among the best, and suddenly you are promoted into a leadership role. Now you have to manage people. Where would you have learned to manage people? Well, most likely you haven't learned it in your education, because most education have technical skills but not people skills as their main focus when they develop people. It also means that unless you've had very good managers who have kind of inspired you, been role models for you and lifted you up to show certain behaviors, then you will fall into that typical role of leading people based on your knowledge around the task that you're so strong in, and not on the people side, which is a very different approach to leadership. At this first leadership stage, hierarchy is also typically appreciated a lot. You may appreciate understanding where other people are in the organization. You may look up to people who have a higher position or higher rank than you have, people that are lower than you. You may appreciate a lot, but you still consider them to be operating at a lower stage, and therefore you have more to say in a given situation. Typically, you will see some expert leaders who have a very, very high capacity to listening to people with more seniority than them, especially if they are higher in the hierarchy. Whereas if someone is more junior and not placed so high in the organization, some may come across as not really paying so much attention to them. But it's only some expert leaders who will do that. Reflection capacity is in its development. It's still early stage, so where the conformer don't really reflect that much, it's more around being part of a group and not falling out. The expert stage has moved to the level where they can reflect upon things, they can see that things goes wrong. They can also, for instance, on the train home, think about that it was not a good day, but still it is early stages, and it's still at a stage where they don't necessarily derive the full story around what went wrong and what they could have done differently yet. Stakeholder understanding at the expert stage is in its very early stage. So experts typically don't appreciate the impact it can have on stakeholders and their own deliverables, that they work with their stakeholders. That can be managing expectations among their stakeholders, or engaging them and motivating them and getting them on board for their ideas. They more see them in isolation, they focus on their own task, and they see the stakeholders as being other players that won't really hugely impact what they're doing. So they haven't fully understood the impact they can have yet. This also means that when experts do communicate with their stakeholders, it's very often in the form of one-way communication. That could be a presentation, it could be sending out an email or a note to their stakeholders. That form of communication does not really invite for feedback or support, it's just informing. Then if someone is challenging them, maybe raising a concern or arguing against them, experts would typically fight and argue very strongly for what they believe is the right thing. It depends, of course, where the stakeholders are at the scale of the hierarchy. So if it is peers and more junior people, they will fight a lot and not necessarily listen so much to other people's arguments. If it is people operating much higher in a hierarchy, they will tend to be much more accommodative and listen more and take on board the input they're getting. In many ways, this is not so surprising, because the expert stage comes after the conformer stage. The conformer stage is very black and white. I am right, you are wrong, or you are right, I am wrong. So it's very kind of one way or the other. When you get to the expert stage, there is an evolution in the way of thinking. So now you graduate it a bit, so it can be very right or somehow right, or you may be a little bit wrong, or I may be a little bit wrong. So there come a little bit of graduation, but it's still the polarization around this or that. It's the same, it can be good, it can be very good, it may not be so good, and the same on the bad side. So there is an evolution from the conformer, where it's very black and white, to the expert level, where it gets a little bit more graduated, but still having the traits of that way of thinking. That the expert really fights for what they believe is the right view and opinion is very natural if you look into the context of the evolution they have taken from the conformer level to the expert level. So at the conformer level, you very often believe in all authorities. If someone tells you something, that is the right thing. When people then move into high schools, different type of education, they're exposed to a lot of different views. The more high education you go to, the more you are exposed to different thought processes and different ways of seeing things, suddenly putting this, that one can be 100% right, into doubt, because suddenly one direction may say this, another will say that. That kind of opening up of the field of right and wrong enables a person developing from the conformer up to the expert level to gradually begin to rely much more on their own judgment and their own evaluation of what is happening. So at the expert level, that capacity has been developed, and expert will tend to then lock in on something, use their own judgment and evaluation, and then make that the right decision. But when they have then locked in on it, it becomes very difficult for an expert to move out of it again, because they have used their judgment and they have tried to judge based on all the available information they had. For that reason, they fight a lot for it, and also struggle with accepting that maybe the judgment that they originally did was not the right one. When it comes to feedback, experts can take feedback, but experts don't thrive in it typically. One of the reasons being that because it means so much to them to be very, very strong within their field, it may be how you feel, then when you get a critique around something that you're not doing good enough, it becomes very, very tough for you to take on board. So you have a tendency to beat up yourself, be hard on yourself, and how didn't I know that, and why couldn't I do this, and why didn't I do that, instead of taking it as an opportunity to learn from it. So it's not so much that they won't take in the critique, it's more that when they get the critique, they really struggle holding it and using it constructively. So they beat themselves up. It also means that when they have to give critique to other people, it sometimes comes across very harsh too, because they have this kind of view that you should be very good at a given task. If someone is not performing to their standards, they can come across as being very tough on people and saying this is not good enough and you need to do it differently, and in that way give a critique that is not so well received by the receiver there either. They have some analytical awareness, so they can evaluate themselves against their role model. So typically, an expert will have some role models. That may be a role model who stands up for their employees, or a role model for being a good leader is that you really know everything within your field and you can share out of it every day to your employees and show them how much you know and help them grow in a given field. So it's very much around the expertise and being very strong in it. They can also identify that they still have areas of improvement. So they have the capacity to see that to really get to that level, which they consider to be their leadership idol, they still have a gap. So they have this analytical awareness that they can understand that there is still room for improvement, and therefore they need to work on something. This was my description of the expert stage. Maybe you operate at the expert stage, or you know someone who operates at the expert stage. In next week, I will look into the achiever, which is the second stage of the leadership capacities. And at that stage, I will go more into depth how certain areas are evolving from the expert stage up to the achiever stage. I hope you found it interesting. If you believe someone would benefit from listening to it, do share it with them. If you have a comment, please leave it in the commentary field below. And otherwise, I hope to see you in next week's episode where I will be looking into the achiever stage. Thank you and all the best. Bye-bye.